Having gone to the sea with her children, the unfairly dismissed nurse was looking for a job on the beach, and upon hearing a conversation between two wealthy individuals, at that time there were relatively few people on the beach. Most vacationers were still sleeping in their rooms after prolonged evening revelries. As for the sea, it was enjoying a break from tourists, lazily lapping at the yellow sand and pebbles with its waves. "Hey, beauty. Are you looking for a job by any chance? Come to my pavilion. We bake pies, pancakes, shawarma, meat pies, church kala. We bake, fry, steam. You'll never go hungry, and there'll be some cash in your pocket," called out Emmy, the man with a distinctly Eastern appearance. She looked around and shook her head. "No thanks, I'll keep looking." The owner of the stand pursed his lips in annoyance. "Well, go ahead, look, but you'll come back to me anyway. Amit pays the highest hourly rate along the coast." Emmy smiled and walked on. Here and there she saw ads for job vacancies. There was no need to rush the choice. There were plenty of jobs. The main thing was to choose one that suited her taste, one that would bring her moral satisfaction. Emmy didn't want to stand for hours by the hot stove, and it wasn't because she used to be a nurse and disliked the proposed job. It was quite acceptable, no worse than anything else. It was something else entirely. Just recently, Emmy had started to faint involuntarily. She would be walking down the street. Bam! Her head would spin, and that was it. Passers-by would fuss around, splash water on her face, call an ambulance. But it was all in vain. Even the doctors didn't know what was happening to her. It happened no more than once a month. Sometimes the interval stretched to 2 months. And it had been going on for about 3 years since her husband's tragic death. That's when the fainting spells began. Doctors attributed it to stress from her husband's tragic death. So, they advised her to be careful. But what if she fainted in Amit's bakery? No, it was too dangerous. Emmy had already circled the entire beach but hadn't found anything definite. Disappointed in the romanticism of the sea, she was about to head back when she overheard a conversation between two distinguished men. They were dressed beach style, but Emmy still noticed the hefty gold chains round their necks, bracelets with stones on their wrists and massive rings. 90s businessmen, through and through, like Heckle and Jekyll. But what caught Emmy's attention wasn't that. It was their conversation, in which she, a former nurse, heard very interesting details for herself. "What are we going to do with her now? She doesn't want to see anyone. No matter how much we try, no matter what caretakers we hire, it's all in vain. She's exhausted them all," one began with a thick, juicy bass. "What to do? Just send her to a nursing home for the disabled and that's it," the second one grumbled indignantly. Emmy frowned, mentally sympathizing with the unknown woman they wanted to get rid of in such an inhumane way, to send her to a nursing home and wash their hands of it. "No, we can't do that. She's our relative after all. And if we put her in a nursing home, there goes the inheritance, out of our reach. You know, Auntie hid a lot in her nest over the years of running the restaurant business." The first rich man grumbled discontentedly. "Agreed. So what should we do then? Where can we find a proper caregiver for this old lady? Someone who can handle anything, even a burning house or stopping a runaway horse?" his interlocutor asked. Standing a couple of meters away, Emmy understood everything. These brazen relatives didn't want to deal with the elderly woman and were thinking of ways to get rid of her as quickly as possible. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop on their conversation. It happened entirely accidentally, unintentionally. She wasn't to blame for these rich folks talking out loud. But on the other hand, what if she offered her services? She was a nurse after all. Former, but still. Besides, she definitely wouldn't make a good salesperson. It wasn't her thing. She couldn't deceive people. Gathering her courage, Emmy asked, "Excuse me, I inadvertently overheard part of your conversation. Do you really need a caregiver?" The rich man looked at the stranger in amazement. Her skin was as white as milk, but her nose had already been sunburned, clearly a newcomer. But what did she need here? Vacation or work? "Absolutely right, miss. We do need a caregiver, but one with experience, someone who knows what they're doing, and without any issues," began the businessman, who looked a bit older than his companion. "What do you mean, without any issues?" asked Emmy. The second businessman frowned. Well, without any issues, we need a caregiver who can handle stress because our Aunt June loves to play tricks. And why are you interested anyway? Emmy looked down as if she had decided to count the grains of sand under her feet and then quietly replied, I need a job. I'm a nurse former, but I can work as a caregiver. I used to work in the intensive care unit, so I've seen people like your aunt about 10 times a day. The older of the rich men grinned happily. Well, why didn't you say so right away? Instead, you've been wandering around asking different questions. If you need a job, what's the problem? I'll write down the address and you're welcome. Hold on, don't start handing out addresses. We need to clarify everything first, so to speak, on the shore. The second businessman rudely interrupted his companion. Well, go ahead, clarify, but then don't complain that you've blown another caregiver, the first businessman retorted. Ask away, what do you want to know? Emmy asked, trying to smooth over the awkwardness. The younger businessman squinted at her. Listen, beauty, what made you leave your comfortable life and come to our coast? Well, the sea, that's understandable. But for work? You must have done something back home, right? Ah, that's it, isn't it? She blushed to the roots of her hair, but still answered the question. Well, you could say I did. I had a falling out with the head of the department, went against him, thought I could get to the truth, but all I got was dismissal. Well, these things happen, it's life, and where's your husband? Is he okay with this? You'll have to live on the premises, you know that, right? The younger businessman continued the interrogation a bit softer this time. What about my husband? He's gone, it's been 3 years already. He was a sailor, spent 6 months at sea on a fishing boat, got caught in a storm, and part of the crew was never found, just some debris washed up on the shore. And what, I have to live at the client's house? I'm not against it, but I have 3 children. The oldest is 8, and the younger ones, a sister and a brother, are 4 and 5 respectively, Emmy replied immediately. After the word nurse, the rich men fell into thought. On one hand, everything suited them, but on the other hand, 3 children, a considerable burden. Nevertheless, what else could they do? After all, there wasn't really any choice. All right, we agree that you'll be with the little ones. It's not such a big problem. As a last resort, there's a guest cottage on the premises. Here's the address. I'm Bill, and this is my brother Nil. Twins, basically. Our surname is Barnett, not sure if you've heard of it or not. That's why we look so alike. And our client's name is June Sutton. Come tomorrow at 8 o'clock and bring the kids along to make it easier for you. And don't worry, we won't cause any trouble. The police station is just a stone's throw away if needed. And I'm not afraid. All right, it's settled. I'll definitely come tomorrow, replied Emmy. The brothers smirked meaningfully, and after a dry farewell headed towards the paid parking lot where their luxurious SUV, the color of Raven's wing, was parked. Emma watched them go and then smiled, hurrying to leave the beach, which had become tiresome during this time. Only now did she realize that vacationing and working on the seaside were entirely different things. Some basked in the sun and got a bronze tan, while others provided this relaxation, selling fragrant corn, cocktails, sweets and ice cream, and also cleaning up the beach at the end of the day, arranging everything so that the vacationers felt comfortable during the resort season. On her way to her rental cottage, Emmy involuntarily plunged into thought. How are her children doing now? Have they woken up already? Did they like the new place? After all, there had been so many talks about the sea. Emmy's mood improved so much that she bought herself some ice cream in a cup and, sitting on a bench, pondered her own thoughts. Her thoughts flowed backward, returning her to the moment when, under the pressure of life circumstances, she boarded the bus and set off with her children to the sea. The road twisted like a snake, involuntarily captivating the gaze of those who traveled it for the first time. "Mum, how much longer until we get there?" quietly asked 8-year-old Nicky as the eldest. Emmy smiled at the restless boy. The little sister and brother had been asleep for a long time, but not him, steadfast, afraid to miss the long-awaited sea. "You could sleep, son. We still have about an hour to go. The road is long. You must be tired." Nicky frowned. "No, Mom, I don't want to. I'd rather wait. I'm not that little." "Oh, who's arguing with you? You're stubborn, just like your dad," Emmy remarked with feigned seriousness. At the mention of his father, Nicky immediately became sad. "I don't remember him well, Mom, only from photographs." "Well, that's okay as long as you remember something," Emmy said, wiping away the tear that had welled up. The scenery outside the window became increasingly picturesque, and the proximity of the sea was already distinctly felt in the air, entering the bus through the open windows. "Well, finally we've arrived," Emma breathed a sigh of relief as she saw the coast in the distance. The trip wasn't easy for her, especially considering all the events leading up to it, including her dismissal and the scandal within the walls of the department for seriously ill patients. By and large, Emmy had long been prepared for the possible dismissal. How could it be otherwise when you have to deal with lies and injustice every day? No, not from the patients, of course, not at all, but from the enterprising head of the department, Harold Mills. Emmy had long grown accustomed to his machinations with paid wards and enhanced service for the wealthy. Well, what's wrong with wealthy people wanting to provide their relatives with luxury care and treatment? To them, it was heartfelt, not a hint that Mr. Mills treated everyone the same. Well, almost the same, to be precise. The course of treatment for a homeless person hardly differed from that prescribed for the relative of an influential businessman. The only difference was in the surroundings and atmosphere, or rather, in the ward. For the homeless, it was a room with walls painted with a fresh coat of paint and a white ceiling freshly whitewashed. But for the wealthy, it was a cozy place with a comfortable bed, equipped with an orthopedic mattress, a television, and a Wi-Fi zone. There was even air conditioning, which they turned on particularly hot days. And everything would have been fine, but in his quest to live more lavishly, Mr. Mills crossed the line, began to keep an eye on lonely people with incurable illnesses with the aim of subsequent moral persuasion. And the motive was one: bequeathing everything to the director with a note on him, houses, country cottages, and even ordinary garages. The cunning Harold didn't shy away from anything. A rundown cottage in the village, dirt cheap? Well, what of it? After all, there's still land for development and access to the river, and beyond that the forest is just a stone's throw away. It should be said that Mr. Mills never engaged in outright criminal activity. He didn't coerce or force anyone. In his own words, he simply helped sick people make the right choice. So, the poor old man didn't need to rack his brains anymore about who to leave his one-bedroom apartment in the residential area to. Harold was right there in all his glory. Here he is in all his glory. Well, what's wrong with him being the heir? Just include his surname in the will, and everything will go smoothly. Emmy endured the director's tyranny for a long time, and then decided to catch him red-handed and film him on her smartphone. She had never had the money for expensive equipment like hidden cameras, and where would she get it from? A widow, 3 children, crammed into her in-law's tiny apartment. And her mother-in-law looked at her with contempt, blaming her for her son's death. In short, Emmy hid her old phone in the ward and set it up so that she could record the conversation. Her colleague Taylor asked her not to do it, hinting at possible problems for the entire department, but Emmy didn't listen. She acted on her own, recording the entire conversation between the director and another lonely grandmother who owned a country cottage. She recorded it, hid the phone in her bag, and went to talk to Mr. Mills, and he, of course, appreciated her emotional outbursts and even offered her a share. "Emmy, what are you dissatisfied with? What's wrong? Or is it working in the department that bothers you? Who gave you money for your husband's funeral? And who gives gifts to your kids for Christmas?" "Right, it's me. And if you don't have enough money, just say the word. I'll quickly throw in a couple of clients for inheritance. But you'll have to try, put pressure on the old folks' pity, shed a tear." Emmy paled. "What does money have to do with it? What do gifts have to do with it? We have a union, by the way. And I won't engage in deception, so remember that. And don't try to scare me. I have insurance." After the nurse's words, Mr. Mills noticeably perked up. "Insurance, you say? Well, show me what interesting stuff you have there. Video where you convince patients to make a will for you, but I'll show it not to you, but to the chief physician of the clinic." The head of the department nervously smiled. "Well, come on, be careful not to mess up, or else my offer won't have any reverse effect, and it will be impossible to play out the situation." "And I'm not going to play it out. I just want to stop this abuse right away," Emma replied rather sharply. The head of the department looked at the nurse with hatred and then reached for the desk phone. Emmy hurried to the chief physician to show him the unfortunate recording. Mr. Sherman patiently listened to her and then asked to provide this very video. That's when Emmy faced a real fiasco, because for some unknown reason the recording was deleted. But the nurse was ready to swear that the phone was recording in real-time mode. So who deleted the recording? I think that after everything you've told me here, the doors of our clinic are closed to you. I won't tolerate slander, and I'm not going to forgive you, the chief physician said, making it clear that her song was sung. Emmy cried, thrashed in hysteria, trying to understand who had set her up. And the whole trick was just beginning to unfold. After all, her colleague Taylor had been in a romantic relationship with the head of the department for about a month. And this, despite the fact that Harold was married and raising 2 young children. It was Taylor who, seizing the moment, erased Emma's phone recording. Oh, and why didn't she take it with her then? Was she afraid that the head of the department would take it away in a fit of anger? Silly, to say the least. After receiving the settlement, Emmy realized that she couldn't live like this anymore. How much longer could she endure her mother-in-law's whining, who constantly hinted that Emmy should vacate their apartment? Although Mrs. Holland herself preferred tactfully not to mention that she had given this apartment to the newlyweds as a wedding gift. And now, here she was quickly changing her priorities and shedding the sheep's skin from her shoulders, becoming a wicked she-wolf. And no one needed her, neither Emmy nor the grandchildren. Emma endured it for a long time, but after her mother-in-law threatened to deprive her of her parental rights, she decided to leave the city once and for all, to the sea, where there are beaches, seagulls, sun and sand. To avoid dwelling on this, Emmy shook her head, thus driving away all unpleasant thoughts. On the neighboring seats of the bus, Annie and Matthew were sweetly asleep, not even suspecting that their journey had come to its logical conclusion. Fortunately, by this time Emmy had already resolved the housing issue and arranged to rent a small cottage remotely. She called from an ad placed on one of the internet portals and made a prepayment. Risky, of course, but on the other hand, insurance. What if she couldn't find anything else? The location was chosen well. There was a bus stop nearby, and the sea was just a stone's throw away. Hearing that the bus had stopped, Annie and Matthew woke up immediately and started helping their mum. Although, what help could they provide when the huge suitcases were twice their size? It's a good thing Emmy had put them on wheels, and there was a handle as well. And Nicky, the eldest, still helped his mum. He pulled the handle together with her, feeling like a real man. Emmy smiled, but didn't comment on her son's actions. The helper and protector were growing up, which was great, and one should rejoice. Seeing the cottage where she and the children would have to live, Emmy couldn't help but sigh disappointedly. After all, in the photo it looked a little different, taller and more respectable, wasn't it? Well, it's true that the sea was indeed within easy reach. "Mum, is this Uncle Dwarf's house?" asked Annie. "No, this will be our house now," replied Emmy, and quickened her pace. The landlady, Mrs. Nash, turned out to be a pleasant woman in her 70s, with kind grey eyes and a network of deep wrinkles around her forehead and cheeks. However, it didn't spoil her at all. On the contrary, it made her resemble a cute fairy tale character. She just lacked a magic wand and a hat on her head. "Here's your little house, not a penthouse, of course, but livable. I don't take a deposit for rent. Payment is due at the beginning of each month," began Mrs. Nash. Emmy nodded, then quietly asked, "Tell me, would it be too much trouble for you to occasionally watch over my kids? At least, keep an eye on them." "Well, not for free, of course. They're good, well-behaved," the woman smiled. "I'll keep an eye on them, why not? I don't have any grandchildren of my own. My daughter ran off to the other end of the country to be with her fiancé, and my son, well, he went down the wrong path. Stole, drank, ended up in prison, as they say." "Thank you, Mrs. Nash, you'll be a great help," rejoiced Emma, and then added, "Tell me, how about work for you? Well, in general. Can you find something worthwhile?" "Work? Oh, my dear. There's plenty of work here, but it's all related to the sea. and not everyone will be suited for it. But on the other hand, you'll always earn a crust of bread, especially in the summer, replied the elderly woman. Emmy thanked her and went to unpack and settle in. The kids obediently followed, eager to lie down in a warm bed, as there was a whole sofa at their disposal, a folding one where they planned to sleep and have colourful dreams. First of all, Emmy bathed and put the little ones to bed, and only then did she take care of herself. She took a shower, made fragrant tea, which Mrs. Nash treated them to, made from herbs she collected herself, with an incredible taste. Emmy's thoughts were only focused on one thing: finding a job. In fact, by profession, she was a nurse, but she didn't really want to tie her life to medicine. When she remembers that she was fired in disgrace, her heart bleeds immediately. Although what's the point of justifying herself now? Everything is clear. After a fight, fists don't wave. Emmy almost didn't sleep her first night in her new place, and how could she when she didn't know what the next day would bring? The unknown always scares, especially when you consider that you're raising 3 kids alone. Oh, if only Edward were here now. After lying on the creaky bed almost until dawn, Emmy quietly got up and went to the kitchen. There she quickly brewed coffee, and when the kids woke up, made their favorite sandwiches with cheese and butter, so delicious that you lick your fingers. She poured tea into a thermos and sliced a couple of apples into wedges for a snack. As she left the house, Emmy left a note for her eldest son, Nick, saying she'd be back in a couple of hours. She wrote it in printed letters, because the 8-year-old boy could only read in that format. In case of any problems or questions, Emmy asked her son to turn to the landlady of the wing, Mrs. Nash. Emmy and her children had never been to the sea before. Moreover, they didn't even imagine what it was like. Fresh, slightly salty air, gentle and sometimes overly sunny. And also beaches, catamarans, loungers, and crowds of vacationers. Well, isn't that a fairy tale? Emmy and the kids were thoroughly prepared for this trip. After all, they bought a couple of large suitcases in advance, in which they packed the most necessary things. When you have 3 little ones in your arms, you have to take everything to the maximum. At that moment, as if wanting to cheer up the sleeping young nurse, the sun gently touched her cheek with its rays, making her smile and briefly open her eyes. As it turned out, Emmy, who hadn't slept all night, had simply dozed off sitting on a bench. Oh, what colourful and wonderful memories came to her in her dream, as if someone pressed the rewind button, returning her to the past. And as for the ice cream that Emmy had been holding in her hand all this time, there was almost nothing left of it. The big ginger cat sitting nearby had licked it all up. All Emmy had left were memories in the form of a piece of wafer cup held in her fingers. Well, you're quite the glutton, although you sea cats are all so cheeky, playfully threatened Emmy the ginger cat with her finger. The cat purred in agreement, then jumped off the bench and lazily walked towards the nearest houses. Most likely his owners lived somewhere there, and the beach was like a hunting ground for the cat. There he could snatch a piece of pie, or someone would treat him with smoked fish. Oh, what a life. Emmy smiled and headed home, although it didn't feel right calling this low building a home, but never mind. It seems they'll move to another place tomorrow, to where that wealthy client, Mrs. Sutton, lives. Upon entering the house, Emmy immediately encountered Mrs. Nash, who came out of the room where the children were. "So, did you find a job?" "I did, Mrs. Nash. I'll start tomorrow, but we'll have to move out. But leave the wing for me anyway, just in case. I'll pay," replied Emmy with a smile. The landlady raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Oh my, where are you planning to go, and where in our little town do they give jobs with accommodation?" "They do, Mrs. Nash. I can hardly believe it myself, but they do. I'm going to work as a caregiver for Mrs. Sutton. Do you happen to know her?" asked Emmy. Mrs. Nash frowned. "How could I not know her? I do quite well. The queen of restaurants and local cafes, though she's retired now. No kids. Buried her husband 10 years ago, and now her business is managed by Violetta, a real dragon lady. She's been married twice, and 3 years ago she hooked up with a newcomer, got pregnant in no time, probably to keep him from leaving. So watch out for this Violetta the most. She's really not a nice lady, I'll tell you." "Thank you, Mrs. Nash. I'll keep that in mind," Emmy replied reservedly. The homeowner thought for a moment, then added, "And be careful with her nephews, too. They're actually troublemakers. Auntie's inheritance keeps them restless, but June isn't stupid. To prevent any mishaps, she bequeathed all her savings to orphanages and hospitals. So they're angry and trying to find ways to persuade Auntie to rewrite the will." "Wow, you know a lot, Mrs. Nash. It's quite overwhelming," exclaimed Emma. "Well, what do you expect? It's a small town. Everyone knows everything about everyone. By the way, if you need help with moving, just let me know. I'll ask my former student, Jacob. He works as a taxi driver for me." A sweet smile played on Emmy's lips. "I'll definitely ask. I'll need his help first thing tomorrow morning. I don't know the city at all." The elderly woman nodded in agreement. "Right, Jake, my former pupil. I worked at the orphanage, let's say, for 40 years, although it's called a shelter differently now, but that's not the point. In the past, Jacob was a civil aviation pilot, flew helicopters. Once he made a difficult flight in a storm, but on the way back to the base, he didn't make it, crashed into a farmer's field. His partner managed to jump out with a parachute, but Jake was badly injured. He's limping now, so he became a taxi driver to avoid starvation." Emmy nodded respectfully. "That's quite a story, and can anything be done about the limp, or is it permanent?" Mrs. Nash wiped away a tear. "Well, probably something can be done, but it's not cheap, and the quota... There's not enough quota for everyone, you know. That's why he's struggling. When his wife found out he was lying in the hospital all battered, she immediately filed for divorce. She said, 'Why do I need a vegetable for a husband?' But Jake managed to recover against all odds. Orphanage kids, they're always strong, toughened by life." Emmy chatted with the homeowner a little longer, then returned to the children. Truth be told, during her absence, the kids had managed to get quite bored. "Hooray, Mum's back!" exclaimed Nicky joyfully. "Shh, you'll wake up, Annie," Emmy playfully warned him with her finger. "So, Mum, did you find a job?" inquired the always curious Matthew. "I did, buddy, and not just any job, but a job with accommodation. And also, you'll help me with everything. Agreed?" Nicky looked at his mom skeptically. "How are we going to help? We're still little, although I'm not against it. What do we need to do?" Emma looked lovingly at her son. "Well, Nick, you just need to behave well while we're living in the house of a very influential aunt, okay?" "Okay, Mum, whatever you say." "Well, I'm definitely not against it," her son replied immediately. "Me neither," chimed in Matthew. "And me too," added Annie. Emmy smiled and hugged the kids to her. Lord, how little is needed for happiness. Children's laughter, the warmth of a family hearth, and the support of a loved one. Oh, and she doesn't have the latter anymore. "Edward, my dear, perished in the depths of the sea. The sea took you away." Thinking about it, Emmy absent-mindedly touched the wedding ring hanging around her neck, the one Edward personally put on her on their wedding day. Wiping away the tears that welled up, Emmy began to prepare for tomorrow's move and the upcoming job. How will this rich lady Sutton receive her? What if she doesn't like Emmy and sends her away? But then again, it was Mrs. Sutton's nephews who hired Emmy. Well, God won't forsake us and pigs won't fly, Emmy thought with a smile. The next morning, as planned, Jacob arrived for the young mom and her kids. Despite his limp, he helped them with their belongings. Looking at the address written on the piece of paper, he nodded in understanding and started the engine. On the way, Emmy and Jacob struck up a conversation and, unnoticed by themselves, felt a mutual liking. Jacob drove the car confidently and unhurriedly. He didn't curse at other drivers, even if they cut him off or broke traffic rules. Sneaking glances at Jacob, Emmy couldn't help but admire how restrained he was, how politely he spoke to her and the kids. Well, perhaps every man who chose the path of a taxi driver should behave like this, and rude and obnoxious people have no place in this profession. Finally, the mansion they needed came into view. The sight of the house amazed the family so much that Nicky couldn't even hold back a joyful exclamation. "Mom, are we really going to live here?" She looked at the driver embarrassedly, then replied, "Well, not exactly live, son, more like work, so please, keep your enthusiasm in check and behave quietly, like a mouse, okay? We agreed, remember?" "Okay, Mom, I'll be as quiet as a mouse," the boy grumbled disappointedly. Since the homeowner couldn't meet Emma herself, her nephews Bill and Nil did. Seeing the limping taxi driver, they smirked knowingly, but didn't comment on the situation. They used to know each other, as they were in the same class at school, but then their paths diverged because Jacob always achieved everything on his own, while this pair only knew how to live off the gifts of their parents or wealthy relatives. And now, Bill and Nil arrived at their aunt's house, clearly not by chance. "Well, Emmy, I'll be off. If you need anything, call me, you have my number." Jacob said goodbye and got behind the wheel. To be honest, he didn't want to cross paths with the Barnetts at all, as he hadn't gotten along with them since school days. "Thank you, Jacob, thank you so much. And I'll definitely call when I need to go to town, maybe for medicine or something else," replied Emma. "You don't need to go anywhere. Your job is to sit with our aunt and watch over her health. And if you need anything, just let me or Nil know," grumbled Bill. Emmy shook her head. Not that she expected any kindness from this pair, but their behavior still irked her slightly. Meanwhile, Nil opened the door and let Emma and the children inside. The kids timidly stepped onto the expensive carpet, afraid to make any unnecessary movements. It seemed to them like they had entered a fairy tale land, or at the very least, a royal museum, where even breathing needed to be done sparingly, so as not to disturb the established atmosphere. As it later turned out, Mrs. Sutton was resting in her room, equipped with the latest medical technology. Everything here was set up for the elderly woman to feel comfortable. Various sensors, devices to monitor health conditions, and even tools for conducting simple analyses. There was even a ventilator and defibrillator, the presence of which genuinely surprised Emmy. "Wow, this is like a whole hospital room," she whispered, half to herself, half to the former nurse. "Well, dear, you think? It's all for a reason, you know. If you don't take care of yourself, no one else will," grumbled the hostess, who had previously pretended to be dozing off. Emmy flinched and looked awkwardly at Mrs. Sutton. "Oh, sorry, I thought you were asleep." The elderly businesswoman smirked. "No, I'm not asleep, dear. How can I sleep when my nephews are stomping around like elephants, making the whole house shake?" Bill and Nil exchanged glances and blushed, looking like guilty schoolboys. From this, Emmy immediately concluded that they were afraid of their aunt and were ready to comply with every one of her commands as long as it happened in front of her. But as soon as Mrs. Sutton turned away, they only thought about getting their hands on her inheritance. Emmy had seen similar situations many times in the walls of the intensive care unit. There, intrigues unfolded as well, and not all of them were related to the activities of the fraudulent head of the department. Sometimes, relatives of the patients would come with notaries, asking to transfer this or that property to them before it was too late. It's an age-old situation, what can you say? Standing before Mrs. Sutton, practically under the microscope, Emmy felt uncomfortable. It felt like she was auditioning at a modeling agency, where she would have to compete for the title of Miss Universe. Good thing they're not asking me to bark like a dog, Emmy thought with irony. As if reading her guest's thoughts, Mrs. Sutton smiled and said, "What's got you frozen? Make yourself at home. I see you're not alone. You have kids." Emmy looked embarrassedly at Bill and Nil, who immediately looked away. "Yes, with kids. I was told you have a guest cottage, or am I mistaken?" Emmy asked. Mrs. Sutton smiled. "Absolutely right, dear. Everything is as it is. You can settle in there and feel at home. And don't think that I'm an old witch who's against having children around, not at all. Children are our future, so we always need to take care of them, sparing no effort." At Mrs. Sutton's words, Emmy's heart noticeably warmed. Mrs. Sutton wasn't so bad after all. So what if she seemed strict? Life must have taught her a lot, making her wary of people. "Well, if everything suits you, Auntie, then Nil and I will leave you to it. We have things to do," declared Bill, exhaling with relief. Until then, he had been extremely nervous, obviously fearing that Mrs. Sutton would criticize the new caregiver again and send her packing along with her nephews. But for some inexplicable reason, Emmy had charmed the elderly heiress and she chose her for the job. Deep down, Emma suspected that the client's sympathy was due to the fact that she had children. Of course, these were just her assumptions, and she couldn't be sure, but on the other hand, she understood well that at Mrs. Sutton's age, doting on grandchildren would be just the thing. And it also seemed to Emmy that the client literally read her thoughts, understanding her with half a word. As soon as her nephews left the room, Mrs. Sutton looked at Emmy and said, "Well, why are you standing there like a statue? Sit down, we'll have some tea, and I'll tell you where everything is in the house. And then you can tell me about yourself, why you came here. I can see you're not from around here, no tan at all, and your nose has already started peeling from the sun. That's always the case with newcomers, I know." Emmy smiled and immediately replied, "Yeah, sure, I'll prepare some tea and be right back. And also make some tea for your kids. There are sweets in the cupboard, candies and chocolate, everything they need after the journey," the elderly businesswoman called after her. Emmy smiled, still not believing that she had been accepted so warmly. To Emma's immense surprise, Mrs. Sutton turned out to be a normal woman with a sensible outlook on life and her own principles. In their conversation, she didn't hide anything and called things by their names. "I understand it all, Emmy. You're just a random person in this matter. I know that before. Bill and Nil tried to foist their caregivers on me, who were thoroughly instructed beforehand on what to do, you know. Each of these scoundrels sooner or later started talking to me about inheritance, subtly nudging me to rewrite everything to Bill or Nil. But I'll never do that. They're good-for-nothings and slackers," declared the woman. Emmy smiled and shrugged shyly. What else could the young caregiver say when she really had no connection to these matters? Let the rich people deal with it among themselves. Her job was small, to take care of the sick woman and monitor her well-being. Unconsciously, Emmy opened up and told Mrs. Sutton about her life and how she was fired from the department. The businesswoman listened silently, only occasionally interjecting with sharp and insightful remarks. "Yes, you acted foolishly, and first of all because you didn't take your phone with you. Although it's understandable, you relied on the decency of your colleague, and look how it turned out. She was plotting behind your back with the head of the department. But don't worry, people like her get what's coming to them. You'll see she'll get hers sooner or later. Although it's better sooner than later, she might live out the rest of her life as a normal person." Emmy shook her head. In her heart, she didn't believe that the department head, Mr. Mills, could possibly be caught red-handed or held accountable, and Nurse Taylor herself was as solid as a rock behind him. Chain of command. Those things are always tricky to unravel. To Emma's immense relief, caring for the elderly lady turned out to be much easier than for many patients at her previous job. Upon closer inspection, Mrs. Sutton turned out to be sweet and kind, not at all demanding and enduring all the necessary procedures stoically. However, there weren't so many procedures. Taking blood pressure, checking blood sugar levels. Since Mrs. Sutton hadn't had a stroke or musculoskeletal disorder, it remained a mystery to Emmy why she couldn't walk on her own, why she constantly lay there, tethered to the bed in the same position all day. Naturally, with such equipment and an anti-decubitus mattress, it wasn't difficult for June, but on the other hand, Emmy couldn't understand what was really going on with her charge. But Emma's kids really liked being at Mrs. Sutton's house. Firstly, it was very big, and here, without a shadow of embarrassment, they could play hide-and-seek and other noisy games that greatly pleased the hostess. At first, Emmy thought that Mrs. Sutton would demand silence and tranquility. But as it turned out later, the woman, on the contrary, asked the children to play and delight her with their infectious laughter. For this, Mrs. Sutton even ordered various expensive toys and building sets online, with home delivery, so that the little ones could play without any restrictions. "Oh, thank you. If you don't mind, I'll pay for this after the first paycheck," Emmy mumbled embarrassedly. Mrs. Sutton smiled. "Oh, come on, stop it. The amount is such that you won't work it off in half a year. Forget it. This is my gift to you. Well, not to you, but to your children. They're good kids, Emmy. I'm not a mother myself, I don't have children, but I feel everything with my heart, you know." Tears glistened in Emmy's eyes. Such an attitude from a client she had never seen before. Usually, elderly people are frugal and try to save every penny. But Mrs. Sutton turned out to be different upon closer examination. Of course, this could be explained by her not very good condition and loneliness, but Emmy had already dealt with very wealthy people who trembled over every penny, afraid of overpaying, hoping they wouldn't be cheated at the checkout. To Emmy's joy, Jacob called her on the first evening of work. In his characteristic, calm manner, he inquired about the condition of his new acquaintance and how the hostess of the house received the guests. "Everything's fine, Jake, really. Mrs. Sutton is the kindest person, and anyway, don't believe what they say about her," Emmy said with a smile over the phone. "Well, that's great. I'm happy for you. Okay, I won't distract you. Call me if anything. I'll be rooting for you," Jacob said with tenderness in his voice, and hung up. Since then, they started calling each other every evening. Mrs. Sutton took it with understanding and never complained when Emmy disappeared from sight for 10-20 minutes, going to another room. She understood that Emmy found it hard to raise children alone, and her heart, exhausted by loneliness, was drawn to the taxi driver, like tender shoots seek their place in the sun. The week flew by unnoticed, during which practically no unpleasant events occurred, and on the 8th day, Mrs. Sutton's business manager arrived. Seeing the new caregiver, Violetta contemptuously curled her lips. "And who's this peasant-looking girl, and what's with the kids camped downstairs? Do we have a new therapy for children now? Miss Sutton found you seeing Siwa. Listen here. Watch your tongue. This is Emmy, my new caregiver, and from now on, I ask you to behave more restrainedly and watch your language. Understood? Otherwise, I'll find another manager quickly. I don't need mares with such stubbornness and talent, you know." Violetta's cheeks blushed shyly, especially at the mention of the word mare by her employer. "Sorry, Mrs. Sutton slipped out." The manager tried to justify herself. "Anyway, I've been thinking about what to do and planning to increase purchases at our restaurant. The resort season promises to be successful, so we need to be prepared for it." Mrs. Sutton smiled. "But it's not up to you to decide whether to increase purchases or not. If I said we're sticking to the same scheme, then we're sticking to the same scheme. You probably forgot. Our entire business is located on the coast, and there, you know, anything can happen. A storm might hit and people will rush home from the resorts. What then? What if it's delayed for several months? It has happened before. So, you know, better safe than sorry." Violetta bit her lip offendedly, then looked at Emmy with hatred, as if she were to blame for the reprimand from her boss, like a naughty schoolgirl. "Okay, Mrs. Sutton, I'll do everything. You can rest assured," the manager said with a respectful tone, and immediately left the room. Emmy sighed with relief. In fact, she understood that Violetta was simply envious of her friendly relationship with Mrs. Sutton, and she also knew that she would never betray her ward, always being there to help her in difficult times. Intercepting Emmy's surprised look, Mrs. Sutton explained, "You shouldn't pay much attention to this nasty piece of work. And don't worry if anything, just stand your ground. Violetta, of course, is not a gift, but in business she's unmatched. I've never met such clever people before. Oh, she knows how to handle things, I'll tell you, where money needs to be made. Seemingly impossible. She'll grease the wheels here, give a bribe there, in general. She's a good manager." True, keeping Violetta in check is a bit tricky, especially after she got married for the 3rd time. You've probably heard about this story. Emmy furrowed her brows, recalling Mrs. Nash's story. "Yes, I've heard something. Didn't she get together with some man 3 years ago and had a child with him?" Mrs. Sutton nodded in agreement. "Yes, that's right. But many don't know all the details, and I myself, you see, was in the know about everything. In fact, Violetta practically picked up her husband from a dumpster. Yes, from a dumpster with a broken head and collecting scraps from garbage bins. I don't know what she saw in him, but she took him in. She dated him and then married him. That's how it happened." Emma shook her head in disbelief. "So you say she dated him, but was he sick or something? Why would Violetta need a sick husband?" Mrs. Sutton looked at her caregiver with surprise. "Looks like you've got brains too, dear, asking the right questions. Truth be told, I don't know either. I have a feeling that Violetta has some kind of interest in this matter. She's become strange somehow, especially after marrying that vagrant. I, of course, didn't attend the wedding. Just sent a gift in an envelope and a vacation voucher. She seemed like the best employee, needed support in such a responsible moment." Emmy listened to Mrs. Sutton and couldn't believe her ears. Everyone in town considered her almost like a female Cerberus, yet here she was, giving out vacation vouchers to employees, caring about their well-being and throwing money around without expecting anything in return. Another week flew by unnoticed, further solidifying the trusting relationship established between the hostess and the caregiver. To some extent, Emmy even grew to love her job, which she previously hadn't attached much importance to. But everything seemed fine if it weren't for one incident that occurred right after Emma received a 2-week advance payment for her work. That's when Bill Barnett approached her in the courtyard, took her aside, and said, "Listen, Emmy, here's the deal. I see you've caught our aunt's eye. You've become like a niece to her." Emma raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Well, perhaps what's the matter?" The businessman clenched his teeth, suppressing a burst of irritation. "The matter is that you now need to help us. We've taken you in, right? It's like living off someone else's purse. Basically, your task is to do everything possible to make sure the aunt leaves us a nil in her will. Otherwise, she's ready to give money to some riffraff, children's homes and homeless shelters. They'll manage without us. But Nil and I urgently need the money. We're planning to expand our business, thinking of opening a hotel complex." Emmy immediately asked, "Oh, well, what does it have to do with me? Please, remember, once and for all, I won't ask for any favors. Do whatever you want, up to firing me, but don't count on my help with the will." Bill's face turned crimson. "Oh, come on, don't pretend to be innocent. Do you think I didn't check you out? I called your department head, and he gave me such a review of you, told me what kind of person you are. Anyway, don't mess up or it'll be too late." Tears welled up in Emmy's eyes. She pushed the businessman away and fled into the house. That evening, Emma was silent and hardly spoke to Mrs. Sutton, afraid of letting slip an awkward word. It's worth mentioning that the businesswoman immediately noticed the changes in the caregiver's behavior and patiently waited for her to come clean. But when that didn't happen, Mrs. Sutton went on the offensive. "Emmy, if something's bothering you, don't keep silent, tell me. I know you talked to my nephew. So confess. What did he want? Probably asking for help to change the will again?" Emmy looked at Mrs. Sutton in surprise. "But how could you know I talked to him? Your room windows face the other side." An awkward pause hung in the room. It seemed like Emmy could hear the beating of her own heart. Mrs. Sutton visibly flustered, then looked around furtively. "Well, I never thought my own caregiver would catch on. Anyway, just don't tell anyone. I'm pretending to expose the mole in my company. I suspect Violetta teamed up with my nephews, so I'm playing the role of a seriously ill person while planning my moves 2 steps ahead." Emmy was almost in disbelief at the revelation. All this time she thought she was caring for a sick, dying woman, but it turned out to be completely different. However, she had no right to judge her client, as she was getting good money for her work and also had good free housing for herself and her children. "Don't tell anyone, not even the kids. Let it be our secret," Mrs. Sutton whispered. Emmy nodded in agreement, still marveling at the twists of fate that had brought her into this wealthy home, full of secrets and family mysteries. The next morning, the estate manager returned to Mrs. Sutton's house. But this time, Violetta was not alone. She was accompanied by her husband, Marcus. Remembering that the woman didn't particularly like her, Emmy decided to leave the room to avoid being present during the conversation. Unfortunately, Mrs. Sutton insisted that she stay. Within a minute, Violetta entered the room in a luxurious, expensive dress, accompanied by a man in a business suit. Most likely, she had simply decided to gradually introduce her husband into the upper echelons of the business elite, although it turned out rather comically and awkwardly. Looking at Violetta's husband's face, Emmy was almost speechless. "No, this simply cannot be," echoed in her mind as she slowly sank to the floor, losing consciousness. It seemed that at that moment she experienced the same seizure that occurred with her no more than once or twice a month. Seeing her caregiver, Mrs. Sutton, Marcus suddenly turned pale and clutched his chest. "Is something wrong? Why have you changed so much?" the businesswoman asked in surprise. The guest shook his head and then left the room with a loud cry. Still not understanding what was happening, Mrs. Sutton stopped pretending and got out of bed. Approaching Emmy, she splashed water on her face to revive her. Violetta froze in place from surprise. "And here I thought you were sick. Whether you thought so or not, I don't care. I do all the thinking here, and your job is to execute my orders on time," the mistress grumbled, still trying to help the caregiver come to her senses. Fortunately, She succeeded soon enough, and Emmy slowly opened her eyes. Looking at Violetta, Emmy said, "Your husband Marcus is Edward, isn't he? He's my husband who died 3 years ago in a boating accident during a storm, right?" There was no response. Seeing Emmy's pale face, Violetta immediately realized that she had encountered her third husband's ex-wife, whom she had once found on the seaside with a head injury and memory loss. What exactly attracted Edward to her at that time she couldn't say. Perhaps it was love at first sight, and most likely, following a strong attraction, she convinced Edward that he was her fiancé. In reality, Edward only regained his memory a year later, when Violetta was already pregnant with their child. The former sailor realized that he couldn't go back home now, as he was bound by obligations to the powerful woman named Violetta. On the other hand, Edward's life was not so bad now, as it included wealth and very large sums of money. With each passing day, Mark, aka Edward, thought less and less about his wife, getting used to life with Violetta. Moreover, they had a common child, whom the young sailor loved with all his heart. "I won't let you take Edward away from me, do you hear me? Especially now that he's Mark. And he also has a different last name, and you won't be able to prove anything. Your husband is dead, end of story," Violetta shouted at the top of her lungs. But Emmy just shook her head. "I'm not going to take him away, leave with him. All these years I thought he was dead. I went to his grave, brought flowers, but I knew we buried an empty coffin. We never found the body. And Edward all this time lived on Easy Street and luxuriated in your embrace." Not wanting to discuss the matter any further, Violetta disdainfully snorted and rushed out of the room after her husband. Mrs. Sutton shook her head, then muttered under her breath, "Well, that's interesting. I thought I'd seen everything in life, but this... One would have to think so far ahead, to steal a man from another family and make him believe he's her husband. Although Edward is also good when his memory returned, but he could have at least let his family know. But no, he kept quiet and enjoyed his new wife's money." Emmy sighed sadly, grateful that the children hadn't seen their late father leave Mrs. Sutton's house. After that incident, the businesswoman stopped pretending to be ill and resumed managing her affairs. She also fired Violetta, who, as it turned out later, planned to take over her business with the help of Mrs. Sutton's nephews Bill and Nil. However, they immediately distanced themselves from the plan and couldn't deceive their aunt. Emmy, on the other hand, remained living in Mrs. Sutton's house with her children, becoming something like her assistant and personal nurse rolled into one. When circumstances required, Emmy measured her blood pressure, took blood samples for analysis, and helped with household chores. As for Emma's mysterious fainting spells, they stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Perhaps upon learning her husband's secret, she calmed down, accepting reality as it was. To Emmy and June's delight, Jacob became a frequent visitor in their home. Mrs. Sutton took a liking to him, knowing about his difficult fate and the injury he sustained in a helicopter crash. It was Mrs. Sutton who decided to pay for the former pilot's expensive knee surgery so that he could finally get rid of his limp and lead a normal life. Emmy didn't even ask for it, as she always cherished their friendship. And 6 months later, when Jake fully recovered from the operation and completed rehabilitation, he proposed to Emmy. Mrs. Sutton, Annie, Matthew, and Nikki witnessed this joyful event. Without prior agreement, they all unanimously approved of Emmy's choice, and she accepted a tiny engagement ring from Jacob's hands. Watching the blushing Emmy, Mrs. Sutton smiled and drifted into thought, mentally returning to her youth. She remembered how, just like Emma, she had started her married life with a beloved man, defying fate, difficulties, and human envy.